one of the experiments is that I wanted to check, instead of changing the flour type, what if you can change the liquid type? So normally you use water, but in this case, I wanted to use other things like coffee, Coca-Cola, beer, and maple syrup. And I wanted to see how would the culture react in kind of these environments. And so what I did was I did 2 controls, which are different recipes. I'll show you in a minute what they are. And then a coffee drink, which is basically a coffee drink you would buy at the store from a can. A non-alcoholic beer, because I didn't want the beer to have alcohol, because that's adding toxin already to the environment. So I don't want to create. I want to have kind of representable results. And then adding Coca-Cola, and then pure maple syrup. So here's also a top-down view of what it looks like. And then what was interesting is after 24 hours, there was a dramatic change. So as expected, one of the controls did very well. Control 2 did very well with expanding the most. And then followed behind that was Coca-Cola, actually also expanded quite a lot as well. But all of them had bubbles, which was quite interesting. So for example, the control 1 and control 2 had bubbles. That means there was definitely yeast growing inside. Control 2 looks like it doesn't have bubbles. That's actually a flour or a kind of shell on top. That's because the surface dried out a bit. So that created the shell, but it was definitely expanding because of the carbon dioxide. And so you're back for a little bit more. Nice, Bex. Nice to see you. And then also the other one, the coffee drink, as well as the non-alcoholic beer, also had some activity as well, as you can see with the bubbles. And then followed by that was the Coca-Cola, as well as the maple syrup. And what was interesting about the maple syrup is after 24 hours, nothing happened. But a bit more time, like 4 to 6 hours, it started to show some activity. And then the bubbles really started to raise faster and faster. So that was really interesting. I don't know if it's because of the high sugar content of maple syrup that the bacteria has to have, or the microorganisms have to have some time to get used to it. But there was definitely some adjustment that needed to happen before it started to grow. And then so what I also measured before and after was the pH. And the pH is important here, in particular for the controls, because what I read online was that if you have a very liquid starter culture, you're going to have a more acidic sourdough, so to say. You have that sour taste. But the more flour you add, it acts as a buffer against acid, so therefore increasing the pH. So I wanted to test that to see if that was really the case. And I also measured the pHs of everything else. So here's an overview of what I've measured. Starting with the starter itself, without feeding it, was actually at a pH of 4. And my tap water was at 5.8. The experimental ingredients, as you can see, the different controls, the different recipes. Control 1 was the recipe I used for the experimental liquids. So for example, using the non-alcoholic beer, the coffee drink, the Coca-Cola, and the pure maple syrup. The Coca-Cola, when I first started, after I diffused or got rid of all the carbon dioxide or the gas inside, it was still at a pH of 2.4. So I had to add baking soda and water in order to get that pH a little bit higher to 3.5, because at 2.4, nothing will grow. It's acidic, and it will essentially kill lactic acid and yeast. So I don't want that to happen, so I needed to increase the pH. But what's interesting is that the culture still increased the pH a bit more. And that's what I wanted to find out, is how does this culture act or react to different environments? So in particular, to the different liquids, as well as also the amount of water it has and or the amount of flour. And what was interesting is in the controls, control 2 did the best in terms of having a higher pH. Even though it doesn't seem like much, it is something. And then with the liquid experiments, it was very interesting how the organism was trying to push or adjust the pH to be more around 4. If I left this longer, I am convinced it would have been evened out to 4, which is really interesting. And that's something that I don't know why. I don't know if the culture is an intelligent culture. It has to find kind of a balance. Maybe that's why in the pure maple syrup, it took some time for it to start producing, because it needed to lower that pH first before it could be in its ideal growing state. Whatever the reason, it definitely had an impact. And what's interesting is that this experiment was just to show what changing the liquid in your culture could do. and then how robust it is and how adaptive it is. So in fact, in this recipe for the cupcakes, I took the pure maple syrup culture left over and I mixed it in with this recipe. So that's what this entire stream has been about for the past week, trying to understand more about this sourdough culture, but also testing in different ways instead of just making bread. The next part, what I would like to do, not next week, but the week after, to make bread with this, to actually see, okay, what does a bread with non-alcoholic beer really look like and taste like? What does a one with coffee drink look like? What does the one with Coca-Cola look like? But before I do that, I needed to first understand which control was the best to do. And therefore, I'm going to use control number 2 to make my first ever sourdough bread here, and then to get a feel for it. And then once I get that done, then I can scale it up from there and try these different experiments. So that's what I am. Basically, this is what I've been doing. This is the science part.